From 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 1. It happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "Where shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his 2 wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household. So they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, "The men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul." So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, "You are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay you this kindness, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strengthened and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And he made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Now Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. So they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." So they arose and went over by number, 12 from Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 from the servants of David. And each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side. So they fell down together. Therefore that place was called the field of sharp swords, which is in Gibeon. So there was a very fierce battle that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as fleet of foot as a wild gazelle. So Asahel pursued Abner. And in going he did not turn from the right hand or from the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, "Are you Asahel?" He answered, "I am." And Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right hand or your left, and lay hold of one of the young men and take his armor for yourself." But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. So Abner again said to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brother Joab?" However, he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of the spear, so that the spear came out of his back. And he fell down there and died on the spot. So it was that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down and died stood still. Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner, and the sun was going down when they came to the hill of Ammah, which is before Giah, on the road to the wilderness of Gibeon. Now the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became a unit, and took their stand on top of a hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be then until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren?" And Joab said, "As God lives, Unless you had spoken, surely then by morning the people would have given up pursuing their brethren. So Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still and did not pursue Israel anymore, nor did they fight anymore. Then Abner and his men went on all through the night, through the plain, crossed over the Jordan, and went through all Bithron and came to Mahanaim. So Joab returned from pursuing Abner, and when he'd gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 19 men and Asahel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin and Abner's men 360 men who died. Then they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at daybreak. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. But David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. The nation voted on something called Brexit. It was close, but it was decided that as a nation, we'd leave the European Union, we'd forge our own way ahead. 5 years ago, it's been nice and smooth, hasn't it, ever since? Everybody's accepted it, and we've just moved on and got on with it. Well, almost 5 years on, we are pretty much there, aren't we? But there's still tensions. We've had protests, we've had demands for a revote, we've had legal challenges, we've had political charadery from people on both sides. No sides acted, you could say, perfectly. We've lost 2 prime ministers. We've had 2 general elections. Loads of standoffs with Brussels. Because transition isn't easy, is it? It was decided in 2016, but transition's not easy. And way back in 1 Samuel 16, so 20 years probably before the passage that we're looking at this morning, David is anointed as the true king of Israel. He's going to be the future king. Everybody knows it. It's common knowledge in the land. But we know, don't we, that Saul, the king that God had rejected, hated David. He opposed David. He pursued David. David has to go on the run. But now Saul's dead. Now the path's clear for David to become the king that he's been promised, that he's been waiting for probably 20 years. But the transition's not going to be easy. There are going to be protests, there are going to be challenges, there are going to be loss of leaders, there's going to be standoffs. And chapter 2 begins with David's kingdom being established. But it's not going to take 5 years, it's going to take 7.5 years for that kingdom for the transition to be complete. And during those 7.5 years, there's going to be loads of trouble. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be simple. The kingdom will not come without opposition. And the next 4 chapters of 2 Samuel tell the story of that transition. Tells the story of that uneasy, difficult transition from David being established as king, being voted in as king, if you like, to David becoming king over all Israel. Now, there's something else we need to see as well, because we're going to come back to this week and week again. This is going to be like the formula for understanding what we're looking at. What we're looking at are real events. You know, they really happened with real people. There's lessons to learn from these real people. David really did become the king over Israel. But ultimately, that's not what these passages are about. The Bible teaches, doesn't it, that David foreshadows and points to David's greater descendant, King Jesus. So when we hear about King David, we're always trying to think in our mind, it's pointing us to think about Jesus. One of the ways that Jesus is described in the Bible is the son of David. So David points us to Jesus. And also the kingdom that God establishes for David in Israel, that points us and that teaches us about God's kingdom that's established through Jesus. So we've got to bear that in mind. So we're going to come back to that time and time again. As we look at David as the anointed king, and as we look at David's kingdom, we need to see that actually it's pointing beyond David to God's anointed King Jesus and his kingdom. So here's how we're going to think through things today. At our best, we're like David. And David points us to Jesus. At our worst, we're like Abner and his cronies. And Abner and his cronies point us to God's enemies. God's got a plan to bring all Israel under the kingship of David. That's God's plan in this passage. God's got a plan to bring all of Israel under the kingship of David. And that points to the fact that God's got a plan to bring all things in this world under the lordship of Jesus. That's God's plan for this world, to bring everything under the lordship of King Jesus, to bring all people, all nations, all tribes, all tongues, all areas of our individual lives under the lordship and the authority and the kindness of Jesus. But that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. The kingdom of God isn't fully established. So I've been a Christian for 25 years, but the kingdom of God isn't fully established in my heart yet. It doesn't happen overnight. So we're going to break this passage up into two main parts today. How God's kingdom begins and how God's kingdom gets opposed. So firstly, how God's kingdom begins. We see it in verse 1 to 7. Firstly, as we mentioned with the kids, it begins small. We see that in the first few verses. I love what David does in verse 1. Ever so simple, but he takes his plans and his desires and he lays them before the Lord. He says, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? If you remember, David was in a town called Ziklag on the border of Israel and Philistia. He doesn't presume, he commits his ways to God. David is us at our best. At our best, we commit our ways to the Lord. At our best, when we've got something new, we ask God for advice. It's called prayer. And that might seem ridiculously obvious, but do we do that? How often do we commit things to the Lord and say, Lord, do you want me to do this? But when we start something or commit to something or think something through, how often do we actually first pray about it? Lord, is this the right thing to do? Lord, show me the right thing to do. So at our best, we're like David. And the Lord says to David, I want you to go up to Hebron. Now, Hebron's significant because Hebron was a place in the Bible where loads of promises were made. Hebron's a place in particular where the promises made to Abraham, that back in Genesis, his family, his descendants, are going to become a massive nation that will fill the earth. And so David takes his family and he goes up to this place, Hebron. And just in case we're tempted to think that David's perfect, we read in verse 2 that he's got 2 wives. We'll see next week that he's added another 4. But at our best, we're like David. Not because he takes 2 wives, but because we submit our plans to God. And then we do what God tells us. I wonder, where do we need that in our lives today? Where do we need in our lives today to say, Lord, I'm thinking about this, can you help me? And then however you feel he leads you to say, well, I'm going to do that. We read in verse 3 that all of David's men, all of David's followers and the families, they come to him at Hebron. There are about 600 of them. They're the ones that had joined David when he was on the run. The rough and ready. They've got issues. And they come to David and they follow him. And we read then that the men of Judah come to David. Judah's one of the 12 tribes. And they anoint David as king over the house of Judah. I'm going to ask you kids to tell me how many tribes there are. I've just told you. How many tribes are there? 12, well done. David's promised by God to be king over all 12 tribes. But here he's just anointed king over Judah. We read in verse 9, it's only Judah that follows David. And the rest of Israel follow another king. See, David's kingdom is overshadowed in size by the other kingdom. David's kingdom's small. It's got a really humble beginning. There are many more bigger and more impressive kingdoms around when David's kingdom begins. But it is a real kingdom. It is a real beginning. It's just small. You could say it's like a mustard seed, couldn't you? Small town, few followers, a king that's anointed and established. Can you think of another king like that? God's kingdom begins small with Jesus, doesn't it? Small child in a stable in a small town with a few followers. So God's kingdom begins small, but it is real. Secondly, we want to see this. God's king wins people graciously. That's ever so important. We see it in verse 4 to 7. He's told it was the men of this place called Jabesh Gilead, and they'd been the ones who buried Saul. You remember, don't you, after Saul had died, the Philistines cut his head off, and they took his body and pinned his body to the wall of the city. Well, the men of Jabesh Gilead loved Saul, and so they launch a mission, and they recover the body, and they give it a proper, dignified burial. The men of Jabesh Gilead, they were loyal to Saul because back in 1 Samuel 11, Saul had saved them from another enemy. But the fact that they were loyal to Saul made them David's enemies because Saul was David's enemy. These are men that had pursued David. These are men that had tried to kill David. So now that David's king, how does he deal with those that tried to kill him? Well, he does it winsomely. Obviously, it were in David's interest to have these men on his side rather than against him. But look how David deals with his enemies. He says to him, you've been blessed by God because of your kindness to Saul. He actually uses the word hesed, which we know that means like covenant faithfulness. It's strong faithfulness. He says, you've shown strong faithfulness. You've been honorable to Saul. And so I want to honor you. And then David prays for them, and he asks God to bless them with the same faithfulness that they've blessed Saul. And then he invites them to join him. These are his enemies. Rather than coercing them, rather than forcing them, which he probably could have done, he says, look, Saul's dead. I'm king. Come and join me. David's a king who wants to heal divisions. I think there's a model there for us. I think there's a pointer there for us. How do we deal with our enemies? How did Jesus deal with his enemies? How did Jesus win people to himself? Well, yeah, of course Jesus could be strong, but Jesus was gentle and winsome. As I think about what David's like here, I think of Jesus' words in Matthew when people gathered before him and Jesus said, look, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, because I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls in me. We've got a gracious king who graciously offers his enemies a place in his kingdom. If you're listening this morning, whether you're in here or whether you're online, Jesus is a powerful king, but he's a gentle king. He's a loving king. He's winsome. And rather than force you, rather than do violence against you, he invites you. He says, come to me. Let me be your king. Now, we don't know if the men of Jabesh Gilead ever took David up on his offer. We don't find out. But it is a gracious offer, isn't it? At our best, we're like David. At our best, we seek to win even our enemies graciously. Not just because David did, but because Jesus does. At our best, we're like David. We're winsome. We try and heal divisions. We invite people graciously. We pray for and seek to bless our enemies. So we see how David's kingdom begins. Not mega impressive, is it? Only small, but it points us to how Jesus' kingdom began. It begins small, but it begins real. It begins with a king who woos rather than forces. It begins with a king who says to his enemies, come over, my friends. Second thing we're going to see today is how God's kingdom gets opposed. And we see it from verse 8 through to the end of the chapter. There's something we need to notice, that if the first kingdom's established by God, the second kingdom's established by human ambition. In verse 8 we meet this bloke called Abner. And a few verses later we meet another bloke called Joab. Both of them are full of zeal, but they're both bad men. Abner's the commander of Saul's army, and Joab's the commander of David's army. Joab's also David's nephew. And we see 4 ways that God's kingdom gets opposed, that David's kingdom gets opposed, and it translates to how God's kingdom gets opposed. Firstly, verse 8, through manipulation. We read that Abner takes this bloke called Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth was one of Saul's remaining sons. And Abner makes him king over Israel. Now, this isn't Abner thinking, well, wouldn't it be great if we continued Saul's line, because Saul was such a good bloke and I want to be loyal to him and it's the right thing to do. Abner's fully aware David has been chosen by God to be king. He says so in the next chapter. The issue is this: Abner will not have David rule over him. Abner wants to be in charge. And so he takes Ishbosheth, and what he effectively does, he makes Ishbosheth like a puppet king. You know, we read again in chapter 3 that Ishbosheth's scared to death of Abner. So he takes a king that he can control, and he says, I'm going to push you forward, but it's going to be me driving the country. One of the ways that Abner opposes God's kingdom is by manipulation and bullying. It's one of the ways that Satan opposes God's kingdom. We'll see that as we're working through Revelation on a Sunday evening, how Satan raises up leaders. He has his own counterfeit little kingdoms. Satan's master at setting up puppet, counterfeit kingdoms to defy God. But at our worst, we can do that, can't we? At our worst, we can be manipulative. At our worst, we can bully to get our way. We can do it at home, we can do it at work. I've even seen it at church. People want to get their own ways. Even pastors sometimes, you have puppet pastors. They're there as the front man, but it's not them who's pulling the strings. It's preach, pray, get out of the way. Well, Abner opposes God's kingdom through manipulation. He sets Ishbosheth up as the front man, but he's the one pulling the strings. Secondly, we see God's kingdom opposed through force, verse 12. Abner takes his men, and obviously there's more of them, so he thinks, right, we're going to crack on here, we're going to get it done. And he takes his men, and he marches them out and gathers them against David's men at Gibeon. It's a really aggressive move. And Abner challenges Joab, who's David's commander, to a contest. He said, look, let's match off 12 of our young warriors. You get 12 of yours, I'll get 12 of mine. Let them scrap it out between them. Maybe the point was that whoever wins will save the battle. I don't know. And they fight, and all 12 of them kill each other. And so this battle commences. Abner's got far more troops at his disposal than Joab, but it's Joab's troops that get the upper hand. 19 of David's men die, 360 of Abner's men die. Third way we see the opposition is through bravado. See it in verse 18. You've got Abner and his troops, and when they realise they're losing, they retreat, they run off. And you've got this lad Asahel, he's Joab's younger brother. He wants to make a name for himself. He wants to take the spoil of Israel's top man. And we're told he's fast. And so he runs and runs and runs after Abner, and he catches Abner up. Abner's a warrior, and to be fair to Abner, he says to Asahel, listen, turn off. If you want some spoil, go and get it off one of the others. But Abner wants to make a name for himself. And he keeps chasing him and chasing him. And so Abner gives him a whack with a spear and kills him. There are lots of people who come to sticky ends trying to make a name for themselves, aren't they? Fourthly, we see it through standoff. Joab and his men in verse 24, they catch up with Abner, they catch up with his troops. It's late in the day, there's been a lot of death because opposing God's kingdom never ends well. And there threatens to be more. You've got the Benjamites now. The Benjamites are proper hard nuts. And they gather behind Abner, and there's a standoff. Fingers are twitching on the triggers. But Abner calls out to Joab. He says, let's have a ceasefire. Sounds really lovely. It sounds really spiritual. He says, shall the sword devour forever? Really, it's just because he realizes he's going to lose. And Joab accepts, but Joab makes the point, none of this would have happened if you would have kept your mouth shut. And they go their separate ways. They live to fight another day, and they will fight another day. How much better would it have been if Abner would have used his energy to influence rather than to gather behind God's king. Abner knew the truth, didn't he? Abner knew who God's king was. But just like those who Jesus addresses in Luke 19, he said, I will not have this man to reign over me. There are those perhaps here, perhaps online. You know who God's true king is. You know who's the boss. You know in your heart of hearts, Jesus is God's king. But this is where we struggle. We say, but I won't bow to him. He won't be my king. You fight him. Maybe it's bravado. Maybe it's just this tense standoff. I won't have Jesus as my king. I want to be in control of my life, thank you. How much better would it be to take up the offer to join Jesus' kingdom? How much better would it be, rather than fighting all your life, to come to God and say, forgive my sins, please, and I'll follow Jesus? It's exhausting to keep fighting against Jesus, isn't it? And yet he says, I'm gentle and lowly, come and join me. How many lives would have been saved? How much smoother would the growth of the kingdom been if Abner had done that? Abner's got the blood of 360 blokes on his hands in this passage. How much better would it be for us when we use our influence and our energy to rally behind God's kingdom? To rally behind the local church rather than to try and further our own little kingdom. And yet, that's always been the case, and it always will be the case on this side of heaven. God's kingdom will always be opposed. We've got to understand that because it makes sense of the world we live in. God's kingdom will always be opposed. The church will always be opposed. There'll always be enemies of Jesus this side of his returning. They will inflict damage. But they'll always come off worse. God's kingdom will never be opposed. God's kingdom will be opposed by outside enemies. But also it will be opposed by those who really shouldn't. God's kingdom gets opposed by religious institutions, doesn't it? Sadly, God's kingdom even gets opposed by people who to all extents and purposes are on the inside. Who really should use their energy to serve, but instead they use it to oppose, get their own way. It damages the kingdom. Always does more damage to itself, because the kingdom's never going to stop. We need to understand, as we'll see tonight, God's kingdom, God's rule, God's reign in our hearts, that the church will always face opposition. But there's a massive encouragement at the end in chapter 3, verse 1. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. But David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Loads of comfort in that verse. Yes, there's a long war, but David's kingdom's established. Yeah, there's loads of opposition, but David's kingdom grows. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to happen. God's kingdom's been established. God's kingdom was established through Jesus. It was brought to pass when Jesus rose from the dead. And what's happening is God's kingdom spreading around the world now. People are becoming Christians in every nation of the world. But it's not easy. It's not unopposed. But God's mustard seed kingdom, it hasn't filled the whole earth yet, after 2,000 years, but it's getting there. Satan's kingdom's being pushed back. God's kingdom's growing stronger. Satan's kingdom's growing weaker. Until one day, just like King David, King Jesus will rule unopposed. Jesus' kingdom will reign from shore to shore. So David does at our best. He seeks God, he acts with mercy, he waits patiently. When we're in God's kingdom, we don't need to be sneaky, we don't need to be manipulative, we don't need to be bullying, we don't need to be forceful, we're to be gentle and winsome. At our best, we're like David. At David's best, he points to Jesus. At our worst, we're like Abner. And Abner actually points us to Satan. I read a great article this week by Adrian Reynolds, one of my friends. And he compares two generals from World War II. General Patton. Who's heard of General Patton? You've all heard of General Patton, haven't you? and General Bradley. Who's heard of General Bradley? One or two ears. Patton was really successful. He was really famous, far more famous than Bradley. And you'd think that Patton would be the one that was rewarded at the end of the war. But Patton was a bully. Patton cost thousands of men's lives by being a bully. He was known as General Blood and Guts. And at the end of the war, it cost him his reward. He wrote in his diary, "It is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven." That describes Abner. And ultimately what happened in the war is General Patton's influence grew weaker and weaker because of the way that he treated his men. And General Bradley's influence grew stronger and stronger. And ultimately, it was General Bradley who got the top job, and Patton got demoted. How was General Bradley described? He was described as gentle and considerate, but not afraid to make tough decisions. That's what a leader should be. Gentle, considerate, not afraid to take tough decisions. And he always, it says, always thought about the effect of his decisions on the ordinary fighting soldier. He was known as the GI general. He was known as the general who loved his men. People served Patton because they feared him. People served Bradley because they loved him. At our best, we're gentle like David and Bradley and Jesus. We're considerate like David and Bradley and Jesus. We're not afraid to make bold decisions like David and Bradley and Jesus. But also, as we see in this, we've got to see this, haven't we, as we close? Jesus is such a gentle but strong king. Jesus' kingdom, just like David's, is expanding all the while. And while there's time, this is what Jesus says to you this morning, while there's time, Jesus gently but firmly says to us, your master's been defeated. Come and join me, because my kingdom's growing. Have you done that? Will you do that? We're going to sing as we close. Hear the call of the kingdom. Give your lives to the King.